fantastic keynote speech, Islamophobia in the age of COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm gonna start us off with some questions, but please make sure to make use of the Q&A tool. If you have a question, just type it there, and I'll make sure to read your question out loud to Dr. Bazian. And if there's anything that we don't get to in time, we'll copy paste it into Slack, and hopefully we'll take care of it there. All right. So thank you, Dr. Bazian. And I just want to start by reading some quotes from your speech and ask a question. So you say that race is embedded in every element of society. Race is that systematic process that causes death and destruction upon racialized groups. And so my question for you, Dr. Bazian, is how do we get beyond the racial state and beyond racialization? Of course, I'm not talking about colorblind ideology, because obviously that's not the answer. But is it possible in the future to live in a world beyond the racial state, beyond racialization?
Well, that's the maybe $100 trillion question today. That's how much the racial industry is benefiting. But for us to actually undo the racial state and undo the structure and the system that informs it, it requires for us to do a total transformation of our society. Our education system is heavily Eurocentric, if not totally Eurocentric. Embedded in it is the both direct and the symbolic effect of race and racism. So we need to unlearn and then construct a new paradigm that race is no longer the factor in there. We have to de-racialize our economy. And that's why I've really constantly visit and read and continue to read MLK's Three Evils of Society: racism, materialism, and militarism. And that is the global system that is there. So it requires for us to rethink society in its totality. And that type of work, as you possibly know, it's only being done in small corners and sometimes at the margins of academia. And more often you are the hot potato and the difficult part of any academia and society that's asking the difficult questions. And then you get, can't we all get along? Well, if you're 6 feet under and you are dying and a knife in your back and the foot on your neck, and then you say, can we get along? It depends on which position you are. So that's the type of, I would say, transformative work that needs to be done.
Yeah, because it's so difficult to undo like a whole history of colonialism and enslavement, and so one thing that comes to mind is kind of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, wherein he talks about how the oppressed need to lead the way to the liberation. So I think this is a good kind of way of thinking about this, that the oppressed need to really lead the way for us to figure out how do we de-racialize the economy and move forward, right?
And it has to be simultaneous. It has to be micro and macro simultaneously. In some of my lectures, I actually begin by talking about chocolate and the whole industry of chocolate, where most of the raw material or the cocoa comes from the southern hemisphere, mostly in Africa and West Sub-Saharan Africa, and 4 or 5 countries maybe account for 60% of the cocoa supply to the market. But yet when we think of chocolate, we never think of those countries that are producing cocoa, and we mention all the countries that are producing the chocolates that we buy: Belgium, French, Swiss, German, Americans. So that's still part of the economy: militarism, the imprint of violence, and then the social patterns as well as religious patterns. Again, I don't absolve religion as well from its embeddedness in this racial theological epistemic as well.
For sure. So I guess a related question to this is, when there's a large section of your talk where you address right-wing populism with its binarism, the us versus them, the blaming and the scapegoating, and of course the simple solutions that are offered by populists like Trump, Johnson, Bolsonaro, Modi,
Mhm.
etc. And so, do you ever consider a left wing populism as kind of a way to push back against this?
Well, the whole notion of populism is very fraught with danger
Mm,
because it creates that the person or that uh, populist leader is the only path towards solving and addressing the problem. And I think the danger in here is that transformation requires a full engagement of all the society, both bottom, middle, and up. In this sense, a populist leader, even from the left, tend to create its own consequences. And in essence, sometimes it becomes a disempowering for the transformative epistemic that we are seeking. Again, you're from Egypt. I think Nasser played that same role. He used populist rhetoric at the time where he was actually engaged in double speak. On the one hand, he navigated to fit into the East West dynamics, navigating to try to project himself as a transformative figure, successfully so in terms of populist discourse, but domestically completely eliminated any center of opposition, any center of what you call contribution. So it became a
mm,
singular state reflective and embodied in Nasser. And we get into the 1967 war.
right.
It was obvious that his internal weakness, he actually overcompensated for it by projecting himself globally, that he is the transnational figure. So leftist political populism is also problematic. And I don't see as the way forward is to shift from right-wing populism to embrace left-wing populism. Now, it might be that they don't focus on the similar type of issues, but at the core of it, it is actually it's removing the layers of engagement within the society. It becomes also a simplistic solutions for a complex multi-layered problems. And then if you impose on it certain cultural nuances, I think it'll become very dangerous, left or right.
Yeah, I think I hear a critique here of like the narcissism that we see in politics, regardless of where you fit on the political spectrum, where the personality or the persona of the politician becomes this source of attraction that we forget about the complexity of views that are important in any healthy democracy, right? So I think
Yeah,
I
what we
hear
need is
that.
structures, more engagement of people, empowering individuals to make meaningful decisions about their life. I'm a proponent of what you call uh, empowering people through cooperative type of economic underpinnings. The whole concept of awqaf at a localized level, where you
Hmm.
actually have a joint ownership or ownership of those who are working and directing their affairs. So in this sense, for me, all politics is local. Uh,
Hmm.
a, a populist at a national level tends to actually be disempowering for the local
Hmm.
aspect. There are exceptions, but for me, the structure and the approach to that type of political order is not appealing to me.
From the ground up. And it's kind of like Samir Amin's notion of delinking, because he talks
Yeah.
about that as well. Here's a question from the audience. If we eliminate Islamophobia at the local individual level, how do we prevent it at the international level, where state processes, for example, political economy processes, provide the grounds for state and personal identity? Since our extensions of humanity often reinforce our own self knowledge, it is even possible to have equilateral validation of all identities, while political economies force us all to desire resources that are elsewhere, which force us to commoditize others and their possessions.
That's a good question. It's a PhD thesis, but let me delve in it. I,
Yes.
I think there is a dialectic relationship between the individual, local, uh, micro level and the macro level challenge of Islamophobia. My notion is that Islamophobia is definitely directed from the top to the bottom, and it does gets to be produced by the state as the first and foremost powerful agent in constituting the otherization. And I look at it in relations to the in the US, the Chinese Exclusionary Act, the anti-Japanese sentiment, the shift on relations to the Latino immigrants. So we do have to focus on the role of the state while we're working on the individual level. And those are not mutually exclusive. They're actually self reinforcing and reinforming each other. It's also accurate that you cannot deal with the local without dealing with the transnational, because I think when I said that it's a structural organizing principle, in the same way that the Cold War arranged for an East-West, and therefore you could not be an unaligned. Even the notion of non-aligned movement came to be almost fictitious often, and it constructed resources at the local level. It constructed the way that conflicts were arranged. So we need to deal with the transnational dimension. And for me also, I deal with Islamophobia in Muslim majority countries, that those countries that want to align themselves into the global political landscape as a result of wanting to get foreign aid, or they want to play also to placate their own domestic opposition by playing into Islamophobia. So it has to be multidimensional. Not each area have to have the same type of tools that are needed, but in essence, we need to understand it that it is a process that has a local and transnational dimension to it. And the major players in propagating Islamophobia for me are the state actors in the sense. And what we need is to focus on changing the laws and impacting policies that will actually lead to challenging Islamophobia in the same way that, again, the civil rights movement challenged the laws, put together the Civil Rights Act, the Immigration Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act here in the United States. And you could see similar type of movements that took place in Europe, in the UK, in France, in Spain, Italy, and then also during the anti-colonial struggles in the global South in the 50s and 60s. So there was an epistemic that was pushing toward those changes. What today is we are lacking the, I would say, the decolonial or transformative imaginary in a unipolar world that pushed on us neoliberal economics, one size fit all, and we are unable to escape the total hegemonic control, where possibly all of us think that the way for us to eat, drink, and relate to one another is by dialing Amazon. So it's really between Amazon and Facebook and Apple, this is our imaginary at this point of how to change and create a different world. If you can't imagine it or you can't conceptualize it, you can actualize it. And our limited horizon these days is that we are only conceptualizing our engagement in neoliberal economics without an alternative modalities, globalized political discourse without alternative modalities. And we have internalized and continue to internalize a racist epistemic without actually thinking or conceptualizing an alternative to it in an actual implementable way.
Thank you, Dr. Bazian. One of the things you talked about in the context of European violence against the global South and that history, or the subaltern more generally, is this historical amnesia, as if, we're not aware that there was Native American genocide, there was transatlantic slave trade, all this, Japanese internment camps, the two world wars, the Cold War, which in some ways that actually, when he was interviewed after 9/11 in the context of the war on terror, he said that the Cold War has not ended. The war on terror could be seen as a continuation of the Cold War in many ways. So what do you think is the reason behind this historical amnesia that we see today?
Yeah, I'm just going to relate an experience in an Islamophobia conference that we had in Sarajevo, Bosnia. And I was not responsible for setting up the program, but they setting that aside. One of the keynote speakers was Jack Straw, the ex-foreign secretary of the UK. Now, Jack Straw was part of Tony Blair's party and government. supported and was behind the push to invade Iraq and joined the invasion of Iraq. Yet Jack Straw, in that conference, which was held at the opening session was at the Sarajevo Library, which was recently renovated after the burning of the books that took place in Sarajevo as a result of the Bosnian genocide. And Jack Straw stands up and calls upon Muslim theologians and Muslim leaders to apologize and basically condemn and deal with both Taliban and ISIS, right? With a straight face. And after he finished, I raised my hand the first to stand up and said, you know, I understand you want us to do this, but what can't you, because you're directly responsible, why don't you apologize for the war and destruction that you have visited on Iraq, being you directly actually involved in the decision making? Why don't you ask Rumsfeld? Why don't you ask Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, and the rest of them to actually apologize? Because these are decision makers. But to stand in here and to speak to us as being responsible for something that actually is part of a foreign policy of the Cold War that have resulted in this violence that is taking place, and we have to answer for it. And if you look outside the window of the Sarajevo Public Library, you see the graves of the massacres from the Bosnian genocide. It did not dawn on him to actually be in that location, in that space, and to begin to comprehend the calamitous decision making that he have done that resulted in the mass destruction upon Iraq and the mass killings that occur. So this gets me into a much more at the foundation of this racial colonial epistemic, that the violence of the global north, the violence of the quote civilized, the violence of the white man burden, it is done for good intention, even if it leads to the Holocaust, even if it leads to the destruction of Vietnam, even if it leads to elimination of whole countries, even if it leads to mass hunger and genocide in India as a result of the British colonial project. It is all for good intention, and in essence, it could be forgiven, because if I kill you while I'm trying to civilize you, then at least if you did not get to be in heaven on earth, at least I'm sending you to be in heaven in the hereafter. So there's whole structure that is informed by a particular colonial epistemic relative to violence, and then who's actually are every human being's life equal. So, and if you look at it, in Iraq and in Afghanistan, we don't keep numbers. Who are the ones or individuals are counted and not counted? If it's a commodified human being, then it's not really a human being that is dying. It's a number. It's from the subaltern. It's from the subhuman, or as Ramon Grasfugel said, it's the line of demarcation between the human and the subhuman. If you're in the category of subhuman epistemically, then losing your life as a result of the intentionality to civilize you, to bring you into the line of human, then really you can't take us you can't actually approach us for this structurally, and as such you could engage in moving from one genocide to the other. So not only that we deal with history, but also deal with the contemporary genocide that is actually completely erased. So that's part and parcel in terms of thinking about violence. And as Muslim scholars, you always are put, the microphone is put in front of you to actually answer for violence. And my response that if you don't want us to be violent, stop selling us weapons, because 55% of the world market is controlled by the United States in terms of our arms industry. And then the next 6 countries are all Western countries. And then you add Russia, and then you get lastly to China after that. So literally, if you want to preach peace and nonviolence, then you can't be merchants of death while simultaneously engaging in this type of discourse.
Thank you, Dr. Bazian. Here's another question from the audience. Why would you think the Muslims in particular are being held responsible for the spread of the infection, particularly in India, as part of the general discourses? Is that related to any particular political ideology?
Well, it's again, I said pre-COVID-19. It's just a matter of retooling the pre-COVID-19 discourse. In India, we've been facing, or in India as a state, has been moving into nationalism, the emergence of Hindutva as the ideology driving the discourse, the evolution and the success of the PGP party, which has a very Hindu nationalist project, targeting both Muslims on the one hand and also the Dalit, the untouchable. So in this sense, COVID-19 immediately reconfigured the notion of love jihad into COVID jihad. So it was a very seamless transition. Love jihad is the following. Intermarriage between Muslims and the Dalit in particular, or other parts of Hindu, is a phenomenon that has been in existence for almost 800 years plus. The Hindu nationalists see this, that the Muslim who are marrying a Hindu is not really doing it for love. So Valentine, what you call causality is not there. So they must doing it to convert. And that also, if you look at it, it mirrors exactly the same type of discourse with the Islamophobes in Europe, stop Islamization of Europe, the same thing with Bridget Gabriel in the US, with the stop Islamization of America. All these are same type of discourses. So when COVID-19 occurred, it's just a retooling and immediately shifting into targeting the Muslim population using social media in particular, fake news without giving affirmation to this idea, but using Twitter, Facebook, and videos that have completely no connections whatsoever, and using it to actually rally people for Hindu nationalism and target Muslim communities in there. So you're seeing that as we speak in India, and least also not to forget that India is right now have a massive operation in Kashmir with close to 700,000 to 800,000 troops in there. So it also feeds the nationalistic sentiments relative to Hindu nationalism vis-a-vis Kashmir. So these all get to be retooled and reutilized at this particular time relative to the violence. And then whatever failures from the state, economic failures, because now India is facing a massive economic slowdown even before COVID-19. You have also all types of political, legal fragmentation that are taken. So instead of accounting for it, you actually immediately point to a scapegoat and blame the Muslim population. And as such, you no longer need to answer for the failures. You don't need to go to Modi, just think of Trump and his ability to deflect a total incompetence. And this is actually even giving incompetence a good name to attribute it to Trump, because this is actually even beyond incompetence. It's really a criminality in how the approach to deal with COVID-19 in the United States. So I would say you could see a similarity in relations to blame, scapegoating, and shifting any type of responsibility.
Thank you, Dr. Bazian. We have a question from Coney. Do you want to unmute and ask it?
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Bazian, for a great talk. And I wanted to ask you, since you mentioned that we have to dismantle the structural industry, I would say we have to dismantle the superstructural industry, not just the legal system, but also the media and its current associations with using Muslims and also Muslim sacred places like mosques to illustrate stories in newspapers about the COVID-19. If you could speak about this. Thank you.
Let me say this, I didn't touch on it in my talk. I do believe that Muslims are being used as the patsies in this discourse to try to reconfigure the society into an imagined ideal past. And these individuals that are behind this ideological shift and push have picked up on using the Muslimness or apparent Muslimness or the Muslim space, bodies and space as a way to reconfigure an imagined past. If you think at what are the key issues that are being pushed in various political structure in the US in particular, or even Western Europe, it is pushing demographic changes relative to immigration and refugees, because the changes of demographics will change even how the society is arranged. So Huntington thesis, clash of civilization, who are we or who we are, all this is focused on this notion that the changes, cultural, ethnic, racial changes, are changing or altering our imagined past that was there, which at the time was problematic, because that imagined past did not include African Americans, did not include Latinos, did not include women. So this whole notion is we lost our country. The question is that if you lost your country, you lost it to who to begin with? And the question, which country you're talking about that you lost? It's interesting, as Obama gets into the White House, that gets to be intensified, right, as a process. Now, media, I agree with Chomsky, media's role, mass media's role is to manufacture consent. Our media is a corporate entity. 92 to 93% of all media that we receive is a corporate media. You know, GE that manufactures and creates, also develop bombs, is also responsible to give us the media content that we consume, as well as other companies. So in this sense, we no longer have investigative journalism, and later on I speak about, we don't no longer have really journalism that gets you to think critically. You're having the talking heads, right? Opinion makers, individuals that could put 15 seconds, and if they are funny, then that's it, that you make it to the upper echelon, even though that all of what you say might not carry forth. You have influencers, and what is influencers is basically you're able to put more shots, and sometimes I'm guilty of that, but again, influencers, and what does this category on all these major, and the more you actually watch news, the more insecure and unsafe, and the more you actually become untrusting of neighbors, communities, and so on. So we're actually all are being conditioned to this phenomena. I like, I'm using ourselves to death, which is the role of the TV and how TV is in use, and now you shift it into the internet and the internet space and social media, which actually you no longer have to look at other people. You actually could create your own bubble and begin reflective on it, which is really structurally create an impossibility for us to create a transformative communities, societies that have meaning, both meaning in terms of their real life and their presence. So I started with the Muslim. You need the racialized target in order to carry forth in a racialized project for the state, in order for the state to continue to consolidate itself. So it's not surprising that with the end of the Cold War, we immediately shifted to try to identify new enemies. So Huntington thesis, or actually it's Bernard Lewis thesis that Huntington makes very wide, the dawn of Orientalism, gets to be reintroduced. And now instead of ending our militarism, our military machine, our billions of dollars, we reoriented, and now we have the new enemy. In such a way, I compared Islamophobia and the threat of Islam is the Monsters Incorporated. That if you go to sleep, you need to check under your bed, is there a Muslim, or in the closet, and you tell your kids, you need to trust Big Brother outside, who's engaged in all types of nonsense, but he's gonna protect you from the Muslim under your bed. And then you have, like VW, which cheated all the tests on their car for carbon. Instead of saying that Volkswagen, VW have cheated, you say there's a Muslim in the engine, and therefore everybody says give up, and you give the rescue package to VW, and you continue to fund $7 trillion on wasteful wars. Halliburton, big companies, Blackwater, all these are in essence using the Muslims as an engine to reorganize and reshift massive resources from the bottom up. So we still have a trickle up economics, which means that we take the monies from the poor and the middle class and capitalize those at the top echelon. So it's really a very sophisticated, very well-oiled machine, which is all racialized projects functions that way. Thinking of African Americans are being used as one of the massive engines to capitalize resources from the bottom up, what we call, I call it the public housing industrial complex. prison industrial complex, the alcohol drug industrial complex, the sports industrial complex, the music industrial complex. All these are channels of literally taking the poor, flipping them upside down, shake their pockets, and taking them and say, you see, we're trying to help you. And what we need is to challenge that structure and begins to really identify it. Lastly, in our discourse, we tend not to want to approach the Muslim subject because we have already internalized a Orientalist imaginary, because can I hug a Muslim, right? And am I safe? So there's also structurally, we actually are organized to fear one another, which is the same in relations to an African American. That's why when people walk around African American, even if they had no experience, they begin to clutch to their what you call purse. They would lock their cars because that structure has already percolated, because we're living in a racist social imaginary. We're living in Islamophobic social imaginary. As the question the following: in the past 20 years, who was far more responsible for taking people out of their homes and completely robbing them blind? African Americans or men, mostly men and women in suit that come out to you with their briefcase to get you to sign on the dotted line? We had 13 million Americans thrown out of their homes during the last 2008-2009 economic crisis. And you would think, we ask people, most likely they blame Obama, not the bankers that already taken it to the cleaner. So these are, again, the frames by which, or the tropes that gets to be introduced, and we are functioning in the world that basically regulates us into these narrow tunnels. And we, even in resistance, we tend to actually sometimes reproduce it. Long answer, but
thank you, Dr. Bazian. I have two final questions. I'm going to ask them together, but before I do, I just want to commend you on the hilarious story, riffing off of Paul Sperry, the
yes.
Obama conspiracy. It reminded me of being in Georgia and with a driver, and I was telling him there's no way the U.S. can have a Muslim president, and he said Obama was Muslim.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, I didn't know. I guess that's amazing. But
Clark Kent.
Apparently he was Superman and he was trained by Yoda, and like there's a whole origin story, right?
Yeah, and it fits. It's really, it fits in the imaginary. You talk to people, and basically that's what they, and I said, you know, you have the Christian coalition in the United States been on it since the 1960s to try to change the abortion case in the Supreme Court, and they have failed. And now you're telling me that from Kenya came this person like Clark Kent from a distant galaxy, and in a short period of time transformed. I said, if he succeeded, wow, I want to join. Let's
too many movies. We watched too many movies. My two final questions, though. You talk very critically about the discourse of humanization, even in the alternative media, because you talk about Muslim News, Middle East Eye, and Al Jazeera as positive alternatives to the kind of over-representations that we see in BBC and CNN, etc., of COVID-19 and images of Muslimness. So if you can talk about the discourse of humanization, and then if you can finish by talking about solidarity, because you actually say populism prevents solidarity. So I think I want us to end on a positive note of how we can, work on solidarity.
What I put a few of the pictures and the coverage from Middle East Eye, Al Jazeera, it was by no means an attempt to say that these are the ideals reflection, but just to show in that story that at least when they presented what is taking place, they offered a focus on the individuals, and while at the same time wanting to critique this whole discourse on humanizing the human. Humanizing the human, the point of departure is not actually the human, him or herself in their own voice. It is actually attempting to get this commodified human to actually approximate to the audience. So basically it becomes that the audience is controlling the scope of what the human that is being humanized is. And in this sense, it becomes almost, at least from my perspective, a double commodification, because it's not only that you are not actually speaking or constructing your own way of engaging in the world, but you're constructing your humanness to the gazing eye, that wants to actually pinch you to see if you could say ouch, and tickle you to see if you can laugh. Whether I ouch or laugh is immaterial to me, because my laugh and my ouch has to be based on the circumstances that befalls me at the moment, rather than to try to prove I'm human. You need to poke me in this response. So the whole discourse is regulated, and is regulated by what you call a super epistemic or superstructural epistemic of what is a human. We are living in a Eurocentric world. Everything about the human, history, culture, philosophy, religion, our understanding of who is a human and who is not, all are crafted in this dominant, hegemonic, Eurocentric epistemic. So when you're humanizing the human, you're actually trying to approximate them to the constructed Eurocentric epistemic of the definition of the human, right? So that for me is a problematic discourse. And unfortunately, many who engage both in the Islamophobia space or in attempted to try to deal and confront racism, discrimination, anti-immigrant discourses, and so on, begin to engage in discourse which affirms the major paradigm rather than negate it. So that becomes really the difficulty and the problematics of this, humanizing the human. You could also maybe touch on it as part of maybe an extension of W.D. Du Bois in relations to this constructing a way with double consciousness that you actually are engaging in. So this humanizing process is actually effectively is engaged in the paradigm of double consciousness in relations to the individuals, the group, or the projects that are being undertaken in society in general. I see a lot of it relative to Muslims are engaging in this discourse. And one test is like, if you walk in and say you're talking and all your questions or your engagements, in essence, pokes some difficult questions. So instead of saying that we are in the land of opportunity, we're in the land of death and destruction, right? That immediately would solicit different response. I'm not saying that this is the mode, but you could see that you are expected to actually create a different type of trajectory in order for you to be admitted into the scope of what the human is in relations to this crafted space. So I could speak a lot about, but this is for me is the problem. The second is about solidarity. We have to construct ways to actually change and alter the world that in front of us. This is not an individual task. This is not even one group. This is not the task of Muslims. If you ask, this is a problem of Muslims, it's a problem of all society and all communities. So we have to refigure, for me, a civil and human rights coalition in you. So I'm calling for a civil and human rights in you that both local and transnational simultaneously. We do have to offer a different horizon for people, especially in economics, because the neoliberal economics has totally failed. So we need to offer people not the critique. I think the critique we're good at, but what are the real meaningful way for an alternative to neoliberal economics? And that's, I think, the heavy lifting is there, because you can't ask people, well, you need to stop being part of the machine. Again, you have to actually provide people their food, their sustainability, their ability to engage. So it might be part of reorienting neoliberal economics is to localize, how to localize economic production, how to get back into what you call a relationship with the land, not in idealist way, Maoist, and but in general, that most of our food supply chain is so extended. I often bring to my classes sometimes pomegranate seeds, from a pomegranate, and you flip it, actually it comes from whole food, but the production is from Egypt, right? So it's packed in Egypt. And it just dawns on me, what does it take for an Egyptian farmer who's like in the Nile Delta, that is actually part of pomegranate farm, what type of production for them to collect and cultivate the pomegranate to be processed maybe in Alexandria, to be put in containers, to be loaded on a ship, to cross the Mediterranean, to cross the Atlantic, to arrive in New York, to be put on train from New York to California for me to pick up a 3 or 4 450 bucket of pomegranate that I know that the Egyptian farmer is unable to eat or don't have the resources to consume. So that requires for us to rethink our economic behavior relative to consumptions and what we eat, and to be innovative in that sense. And then I would say for us to think different politics, how to make different political in a two-party system in the US, or in also much of the world, a two-party political system, right and left. In that sense, that type of solidarity needs to be there. And lastly, we need to support individuals, organization groups that are mounting resistance under overwhelming odds. And I do have a 10-point engagement of how for people to actually counter and begin to build solidarity, because that's the only way to go forward. And solidarity does not mean uniformity, because again, people think that I'm in solidarity with you if you agree with me 100%. I don't agree with myself between the morning and the evening, I always say. So solidarity means to actually agree on what are the things that are meaningful for all of us, that you can actually, and myself collectively, we could transform. Does not mean you need to agree with me, but to make it possible for you to actualize your full scope of what does it mean to be you, and also for what does it mean to be me, so we could have a we coming out in the society. That's the type of solidarity and heavy lifting. And last word, social media actually almost prevents this from taking place, because it puts the ego as the foremost in the work. And for psychologists, you know how destructive the ego is. So even the modes of technology today is heavily, heavily problematic. So we still need to find the different alternative ways for these solidarities to be built. And key is a local level for me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bazian. We
You're
really
welcome.
appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Good
All
to be
right.
with you, and good luck for the rest of the conference. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right.